When fog rolls in, the line between safety and slaughter vanishes. From an airfield in Ussuri to a quiet Montana rest stop, these true encounters reveal how bears can emerge from absolute silence, striking before anyone can react. Rafts flip, RVs crumple, and entire markets descend into panic. In this video, we'll dive into 6 terrifying bear attacks that turned ordinary moments into chaos, proving that nature's calm can shatter in an instant. It was October 14, 2024, in the thick wilderness of Russia's Ussuri Krai, where cold fog blanketed an abandoned military airfield hidden among dense pines and tall grass. The cracked concretes had long been reclaimed by nature, covered in moss, wet leaves, and rusted equipment half swallowed by the earth. Pavel Sidorov, a 47-year-old maintenance engineer from Khabarovsk, had been working in harsh and isolated locations for most of his career. He was experienced, disciplined, and trusted with dangerous fuel infrastructure inspections across remote areas. His partner that morning was Mikhail Antonenko, 44, a quieter man with a background in electrical systems and a steady record of safety-first work in the Far East. Both men had been assigned to inspect aging fuel tanks and auxiliary generators left at this remote outpost. The operation was routine on paper, but made difficult by overgrown terrain, rotting structures, and the known presence of large predators in nearby forests. Pavel had taken part in similar missions many times before, confident in his ability to handle mechanical hazards and harsh weather. Mikhail was the cautious one, double-checking gauges, cables, and safety equipment with slow precision. Together, they formed a reliable field team, trusted to handle locations no one else wanted. The morning was silent except for wind moving through the pine branches. The air smelled of wet earth, frozen fuel vapors, and decaying wood. Heavy fog sat low over the ground, making it hard to see more than a few meters ahead. Their boots sank slightly into cold mud as they moved across the old runway, pushing a dolly loaded with tools and replacement parts. The fuel storage cylinders waited ahead like rusted giants, half hidden in mist and vines. They reached the first generator near a collapsed metal fence. Mikhail unpacked meters and cables, while Pavel secured the dolly against the uneven concrete. The fog around them shifted slowly, dulling every sound. The atmosphere felt heavy, the kind of stillness that made every small noise seem louder than it should. As Pavel repositioned a metal drum on the dolly, its rusted bottom slipped. The drum dropped hard onto the concrete with a sharp metallic crash that echoed across the abandoned airfield. The sound cut through the fog like a flare. Only seconds later, the forest responded. From the edge of the tree line, a massive Russian grizzly bear emerged through the mist, its fur wet and bristling, breath steaming in the cold air. It had likely been foraging nearby, drawn by old fuel scents or small animals nesting under machinery. The sudden noise had triggered its instinct to attack. Before either man could fully react, the bear charged across the broken pavement, its heavy paws thudding against the ground with terrifying speed. The bear crossed the distance in seconds, its massive body bursting through the fog as it charged directly toward the men. Pavel barely had time to turn before the animal struck him with full force, lifting him off his feet and slamming him backward against the metal frame of the generator. The impact rattled the machine and sent tools crashing to the ground. Mikhail staggered back, reaching for the flare launcher strapped to his pack. His hands shook as the Russian Grizzly reared up, towering over Pavel, its weight crushing him against the cold steel. Mikhail fired the flare at the ground near the animal. The blast ignited the fog into an eerie blood-red glow. The sudden burst of light and sound startled the bear, but did not stop it immediately. It roared and swung its head wildly, knocking cables and equipment aside. Mikhail shouted and advanced, firing another flare closer this time. The blazing light and sharp hiss filled the air as smoke swirled in the mist. At last, the noise and light overwhelmed the animal's charge. The grizzly lurched back, shaking its head, muscles rippling with rage. It turned sharply, then vanished into the thick fog as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only trembling silence behind. The red glow of the flare slowly faded, leaving the airfield cold and still once more. Mikhail ran to Pavel's side. The generator was bent, dented from the force of the impact. Pavel lay motionless on the ground, his gear scattered, his chest barely rising. Mikhail tried to lift him but realized the injuries were severe. Panic and disbelief froze him in place as minutes passed like hours in the thick, silent fog. Nearly 40 minutes later, the first rescue crew arrived, guided only by weak radio contact. Mikhail sat in shock beside his fallen partner, staring into the tree line where the bear had disappeared. Medics confirmed what was already clear. Pavel had died almost instantly from the crushing impact. The area was locked down immediately. Authorities declared the abandoned airfield off-limits, warning that large predators were roaming dangerously close to human operations. Workers were ordered to stay away until full safety measures could be restored. In the days that followed, the incident spread across regional safety networks as a grim reminder. Even trained specialists with years of field experience could be caught off guard in the silent fog of Ussuri Krai, where nature, sudden and unseen, always held the final say. It was September 14th, 2025, along a lonely stretch of highway in western Montana, where thick fog rolled over the road like smoke before sunrise. The air was cold and damp, and only the faint sound of distant trucks could be heard beyond the mist. Derek Lawson, a 50-year-old long-haul truck driver from Idaho, had been on the road for over 10 hours, hauling freight across state lines. He had spent almost 25 years in the trucking industry, used to empty roads, freezing nights, and long hours behind the wheel. Derek was disciplined and careful, known for strict maintenance checks every time he stopped. He avoided crowds, preferred isolated rest areas, and trusted early dawn hours more than busy afternoons. He had delivered loads through deserts, icy passes, and endless wheat fields across the Midwest. Growing up around logging trucks in his hometown, Derek learned early that one mistake on the road could cost a life. His rig was his second home, stocked with tools, emergency gear, and meals packed from gas stations along the way. That morning, after driving through fog-darkened mountain roads for hours, he pulled into a small highway rest stop surrounded by pine trees and silent hills. The faint yellow lights from the lot reflected off the swirling mist, making everything look blurred and distant. Derek parked near the far end of the lot, away from the few other vehicles. The smell of damp asphalt and pine needles filled the air as he stepped down from the cab. He carried a flashlight in one hand and moved slowly around the truck to check the tires and brakes, a habit before continuing any long stretch of travel. The fog clung low to the ground, hiding the edges of the cracked pavement and the old trash dumpster near the back fence of the stop. Food wrappers and drink cups lay scattered nearby, left behind by careless travelers. Then movement stirred near the dumpster. A large black figure emerged silently from behind it. A black bear, broad-shouldered and heavy, its fur wet and dark from the night air, stepped into view. It had been drawn by the smell of fast food thrown into the trash, its nose lowered to the pavement, sniffing at old grease spilled across the asphalt. Before Derek could react, the bear lunged straight toward him. The force of the impact slammed him backward into the steel step under the cab door. Pain shot through his shoulder as he struck the metal edge, his jacket tearing open instantly. He collapsed against the side of the rig, struggling for balance as the fog wrapped around them like smoke. The bear reared up and swiped at his legs. Its claws tore through denim like paper, leaving deep burning scratches across his shin. Derek's flashlight hit the ground and rolled away into the mist as he twisted to escape, his knee smashing hard against the pavement. The cold morning silence shattered as the struggle exploded across the empty lot. Derek rolled across the rough asphalt as the black bear swiped again, its heavy paws striking the side of the truck and rattling the metal. The fog made every shape look distorted, but the weight of the animal and the scrape of its claws were unmistakable. He forced himself onto one knee despite the pain, his leg throbbing and his ribs aching from the earlier hit. His hand swept across the ground, searching desperately through gravel and litter until it struck the hard plastic of his emergency flare gun beneath the cab. The bear advanced, snout low to the ground, claws scraping the pavement as it followed the smell of spilled food from his lunch bag that had burst open during the struggle. Derek aimed the flare gun with shaking hands and fired toward the ground in front of the animal. The sudden burst of sparks and firelight shot through the fog, lighting up the parking lot in a brief flash of red. The crackling flare hissed across the wet pavement. The bear flinched sharply and stopped. For a moment, both man and animal stood frozen in the cold silence. Then, with a deep snort, the bear lowered its head and backed away from the burning flare. It turned slowly, disappearing into the fog near the tree line, the sound of its breathing fading into the dark woods. Derek stayed crouched on the ground, heart pounding, mud and grease smeared across his torn clothes. When the danger had passed, he pulled himself back up to the open cab, using the step railing for support. His shin was bleeding where the claws had cut deep, and his shoulder throbbed from the impact against the steel. His lunch bag was shredded, food scattered across the pavement, and fresh claw marks carved into the side of the truck. Once back inside the cab, he grabbed bandages from his emergency kit and wrapped his leg before calling for help. Authorities arrived later that morning and placed warning signs along the rest stop, reminding travelers not to leave food or trash exposed. Wildlife officers confirmed that bears often roam isolated Montana rest areas in search of easy meals left behind by careless drivers. Derek survived with bruises, deep scratches, and a shaken sense of safety. That morning changed the way he viewed even the simplest roadside stop. It was August 14, 2023, on Kodiak Island in southwestern Alaska, where a narrow glacial river cut through steep moss-covered cliffs and mist rolled low across the water like drifting smoke. Morning light had barely risen over the valley, leaving everything cold, silent, and half-hidden by fog. Thomas Granger, a 49-year-old hunter from Montana, sat at the front of a small inflatable raft. He had spent years traveling the northern wilderness during salmon season, known among fellow outdoors people for his discipline and caution. This trip to Kodiak was planned months in advance, and he had come prepared as always, carrying nets, traps, and carefully packed supplies. Behind him was his longtime hunting partner, Evan Blake, 46, a former wilderness guide from Washington State, who had worked across rivers and mountain ranges his entire life. Evan was steady, observant, skilled at reading wind and water. The two men had survived many harsh trips together and trusted each other completely. That morning, they floated quietly down the river, scouting salmon movement before the fishing season officially opened. The inflatable raft moved slowly with the current, barely making a sound on the black, icy water. The air was damp and bitterly cold. Salmon flashed beneath the surface, and the smell of fresh fish traveled through the fog. The riverbanks were lined with thick brush and twisted roots, hidden under shadow. They moved with care, knowing that Kodiak bears often patrolled river edges during salmon runs. Thomas leaned forward, steadying the net he had set along the raft's edge. The water swirled hard around submerged boulders, and the raft shifted with each small current change. The silence was deep, broken only by the faint splash of salmon downstream. Then, without warning, a massive Kodiak bear burst from the fog-covered bank just a few feet away. It had likely been drawn by the scent of baited traps carried in the raft. The huge animal lunged with incredible force, striking the side of the inflatable craft. The raft tipped violently to one side, throwing both men into the frigid water. The cold shock was instant. Thomas hit first, slamming into jagged rocks just beneath the surface. The bear roared and lunged again, its immense paw crashing into Thomas and pinning him against the stone. Water churned as the powerful animal attacked relentlessly. Evan tried to grab onto the raft, struggling to keep it from flipping completely as gear scattered into the river. He could barely see through the fog and spray, but he heard the loud crashes as the bear continued to target Thomas. Thomas tried to push away, but the current and the force of the blows kept him trapped. The freezing water slowed his movements, each breath harder than the last. Evan reached for anything he could throw, batteries, tools, packs, anything to distract the animal. But the bear remained locked on its target, striking again through the water, the river echoing with violence beneath the ghostly mist. Evan pushed against the freezing current, fighting to keep his balance as the massive bear continued its assault on Thomas. The water surged around them, dark and ice-cold, making every movement feel slow and heavy. Thomas remained trapped against the sharp rocks, his strength fading as the bear struck again, its enormous paw sending water and debris flying into the air. Evan threw a heavy metal container toward the animal, forcing it to pause for a brief moment before lowering its head again toward the river. The beast lunged once more, crashing through the shallows with relentless power. Evan gripped the raft's rope to keep himself from being swept downstream. He could barely feel his hands or legs as the cold tightened around his body like iron. Every second felt longer than the last. The bear slammed Thomas again, its claws tearing through the water with violent precision. The sound of rocks scraping beneath the struggle echoed through the fog. Finally, after what felt like endless minutes, the animal began to retreat. It pulled back slowly, its head low, and its breath steaming into the air. It watched for movement as if expecting resistance, then turned and disappeared into the white curtain of fog that covered the riverbank. The water calmed slightly. The silence that followed felt heavier than the attack itself. Evan pushed through the current, struggling toward Thomas. When he reached him, he dropped to his knees in the icy water. Thomas lay against the rocks, motionless. His injuries were severe, his breathing almost gone. Evan tried to shift him onto the raft, but the river made every movement difficult. Within moments, Thomas's body went limp. The freezing water rushed around them as Evan pulled him fully into the raft, his own arms shaking uncontrollably from cold and shock. He steadied the raft and let the current carry it slowly downstream, using his remaining strength to guide it away from sharp rocks and overhanging branches. The river felt endless. The fog never lifted. Time passed slowly as the pain in his arms and legs grew harsher. Every part of him ached, his chest strained with each breath. He glanced back again and again at the riverbank, certain the bear might return. But nothing moved except drifting mist and cold water. Eventually, Evan reached a wider bend in the river where a gravel bar broke the current. He pushed the raft toward land and collapsed onto the wet stones. His clothes were soaked through, and his body shook violently with early hypothermia. He pulled Thomas closer to the bank, but the stillness told him the outcome was final. The weight of the moment sank in with a crushing silence. Hours later, rescue teams arrived after a distress signal was received from their equipment downstream. Evan was barely conscious when they carried him to safety. Thomas was declared dead from severe blunt force trauma and lacerations. Officials later confirmed that the smell of fish and bait had likely drawn the bear, made unusually bold by constant feeding along the river. Evan survived with bruises, frostbite, and lasting trauma. For weeks, he struggled to sleep, haunted by the moment the fog opened and the river turned violent without warning. The attack became a reminder across Kodiak Island that even years of experience mean little when nature decides otherwise. It was August 19th, 2017, in a secluded RV campground hidden deep in northern Wyoming, surrounded by thick pine forest and wide open meadows where elk often grazed at dusk. The sky was clear, the night air cool after a warm summer day, and the campsite sat miles away from the nearest highway or town. David Harper, a 49-year-old outdoor enthusiast from Montana, had driven to the campground with his wife Samantha Harper to spend the weekend with close friends. David worked as a construction engineer and was known for his calm nature, love for mountain landscapes, and habit of taking weekend trips into quiet wilderness areas with his family. Samantha, 47, enjoyed these trips just as much. She had grown up near Yellowstone and was familiar with nature, but she also understood the dangers that came with living near bear country. The couple often traveled with friends in their RV during late summer, enjoying campfires, hiking trails, and nights under the stars. Their group had arrived earlier that afternoon, grilling salmon over an open fire before turning in for the night. Some coolers and trash bags containing food scraps sat near the trailer, not yet stored away. The smell lingered in the still air, drifting slowly toward the tree line. By midnight, the campground had gone silent. The stars glowed faintly above the pine canopy, and a thin layer of fog began to form across the damp ground. The only sounds were crickets and the soft creak of trees swaying in the dark. It felt peaceful, untouched, and safe. Deep in the woods beyond the meadow, however, something was moving. Drawn by the strong scent of salmon and open trash, a massive grizzly bear made its way through the forest. Its paws sank into soft earth and pine needles as it followed the trail of scent toward the campers. Just after 2 in the morning, a heavy rustling came from the tree line. Metal bins toppled, clattering against rocks. Folding chairs crashed to the ground as the bear pushed past the tables and coolers. A low, guttural growl echoed across the lot, vibrating through the quiet air. David woke instantly. His instincts told him something was wrong. He stepped outside with a flashlight in hand. The ground was cold beneath his feet. As he moved forward, the beam of light cut through the darkness and caught a massive snout coated in moisture, inches from the edge of the fire pit. The animal's towering frame stood only yards away, muscles shifting beneath thick fur as it lifted its head toward the light. Before David could react, the grizzly charged with explosive force. The impact threw him violently against the metal side of his RV, shaking the entire trailer. Coolers flew across the ground, chairs folded and flipped. Samantha screamed from inside as nearby campers jolted awake and began hitting car alarms and slamming on trailer walls in panic. The grizzly's massive body crashed against the side of the trailer again, its claws scraping metal as it tore through coolers and food containers scattered across the ground. David lay on the dirt beside the RV, struggling to push himself up as pain spread through his ribs and arms. The night filled with rapid movement. Car alarms blared, lights flashed through the dark, and metal frames rattled as campers struck the sides of their trailers in an attempt to scare the animal away. The bear swung its head, growling low as it pawed at overturned bins, its fur glistening under the dim light. Samantha stayed inside, frozen in shock, as she heard heavy thuds shaking the walls around her. The campsite looked like a storm had torn through it. Food scraps were scattered across the grass. Plastic lids and broken chairs littered the ground, and muddy paw prints led back and forth from the trees to the trailers. Some campers honked their vehicle horns, while others used high beams to blind the animal. The noise built slowly until the entire campground became chaotic. The grizzly stepped back for a moment, head turning toward the forest before charging again. This time it struck the rear of the RV with such force that the back wheel lifted slightly off the ground before slamming back into the dirt. David lay motionless now, badly injured, his body pressed against the cold soil. The bear lowered its head and inspected the ground around him, sniffing deeply before snapping at nearby debris. Its heavy breath steamed in the night air. The noise from the other trailers finally intensified enough to disrupt its focus. Multiple horns blared in unison. Flashing lights swept across its eyes. The animal hesitated, snarled once, then turned away and retreated toward the dark tree line. Its large silhouette moved into the fog, vanishing between the pines as the sounds of alarm continued to echo through the still campground. Rangers arrived minutes later, their headlights lighting the ground where David lay. Broken items covered the clearing like scattered wreckage. The air still smelled of salmon and trash. Emergency responders rushed to David's side and checked his pulse, but his injuries were too severe. Samantha stepped outside moments later, trembling as she saw the scene. The campground that had been silent and calm just an hour earlier now looked torn apart, with frightened campers gathered near their vehicles and belongings tossed everywhere. By dawn, the area had been secured and everyone was instructed to remain inside their RVs. Wildlife officers inspected the damage and followed the trail of deep tracks leading back into the forest. They confirmed that food scent had drifted straight from the campsite into the woods, pulling the bear directly to the trailers. Officials warned that even sealed containers could not mask strong odors, especially salmon and other high-fat foods. The debris remained scattered across the grass as the sun began to rise. The event spread quickly through nearby towns, serving as a harsh warning about the dangers of careless food handling in grizzly territory. Samantha later left the campground with friends, shaken and silent, carrying only a few belongings. For everyone who witnessed that night, The sight of that powerful predator tearing through a place of rest changed the way they viewed even the quietest corners of the wilderness. It was June 14, 2019, in the icy wilderness of Svalbard, a remote Norwegian archipelago deep within the Arctic Circle. A cold wind rolled in from the sea as a small expedition group from a cruise vessel stepped onto a frozen shoreline of fractured ice and pale blue glaciers. The land was silent except for distant waves and creaking ice shifting beneath layered snow. Standing at the front was Annika Johansson, a 34-year-old expedition guide from Tromsø. She had spent years working in Arctic tourism, trained in wildlife behavior, emergency protocols, and survival in freezing conditions. Calm, disciplined, and highly respected, she led dozens of such excursions every season. Among the travelers was Lars Henriksen, a 45-year-old engineer from Denmark with a deep interest in polar wildlife. He was known for his fascination with extreme environments and had taken several nature-focused trips across northern Europe. This Arctic journey was his first time so close to the raw, untouched edge of the polar world. The cruise had offered a guided shore landing to photograph seals resting on ice formations near the water's edge. Lars, carrying a professional camera, was eager to capture the sea life that thrived in these frozen depths. The group followed Annika carefully across the glacial outcrop. The ice was uneven and streaked with cracks, while pools of meltwater made the surface slippery. The fog was thick, a cold, milky haze that drifted across the ice, shrinking visibility with every passing minute. The tourists kept close together as Annika reminded them to stay alert. The Arctic was as stunning as it was unforgiving. Food and scents, even tiny traces, could travel quickly through the frozen air. On the far edge of the landing site, another guide had set down a small cooler of sealed snacks and emergency supplies. But unnoticed by the group, bits of fish waste from the ship kitchen had been left behind earlier near the landing zone. In a region ruled by predators with powerful senses, even that was enough to shift the balance of safety. The tourists crouched to take photos of seals lounging peacefully on the distant ice. The scene felt calm, almost silent, until a low crunch broke through the fog from behind the group. From the mist emerged a full-grown polar bear, its white coat blending almost perfectly with the frozen landscape. It moved with startling silence, nose raised, catching the scent of the discarded fish. Its black eyes scanned the area, drawn not to the people first, but to the cooler. Annika turned sharply as the bear came into view. The powerful animal strode forward faster than most could react. In a single motion, it lunged at the cooler, claws tearing it open, sending frozen provisions across the ice. The sudden rush of movement shook the group. Tourists staggered backward. Ice cracked beneath boots. Lars lost his footing completely, falling hard against a jagged shard of ice. Sharp pain sliced across his forehead as blood began to drip down into the snow. Lars pressed a hand to his forehead as the cold air stung the open wound. The bright red streak across the ice stood out sharply against the pale surface. He tried to steady himself, but the slick ground made every movement uncertain. Around him, the rest of the group scrambled to regain balance, slipping on frozen ridges as the polar bear continued to thrash through the scattered contents of the cooler. Shattered ice and pieces of frozen food littered the area. The animal lifted its head again, ears raised, breath visible in heavy white bursts. Its focus shifted briefly toward the movement of frightened tourists. Annika stepped forward with firm control, her emergency flare launcher already drawn. She aimed it high toward the air beside the bear. A bright burst of light and sound tore through the fog, trailing sparks across the ice. The sudden motion and burning signal caused the polar bear to recoil sharply. It paused, snarled, then turned and lumbered back toward the fog-covered cliffs, its broad frame fading gradually into the white mist. The tension hung in the air even after the animal disappeared. Every tourist remained frozen in place, barely breathing, afraid to move too soon. Only when the echo of the flare faded into silence did the group begin to recover. Two travelers moved carefully to assist Lars, helping him rise from the ice. His forehead continued to bleed steadily, dripping down his face and onto his jacket. Though conscious, he was visibly dazed, his steps unsteady. The group formed a tight formation around him, as Annika led them back across the uneven terrain toward the small landing craft that was still waiting along the shoreline. Every footstep was taken slowly, the memory of how silently the predator had arrived still fresh in their minds. As they reached the inflatable boat, crew members helped Lars aboard first. The moment the passengers were secured, the vessel pushed away from the ice, the roar of its motor breaking the long silence. The ship loomed ahead through the fog, waiting like a lifeline in the frozen wilderness. Once on deck, medical crew rushed Lars to the infirmary, where his forehead wound was cleaned and stitched. He had no broken bones, but suffered shock and dizziness from the fall. Back on the glacier, scattered remains of crushed frozen food and broken camera equipment remained on the ice as silent proof of how close the group had come to disaster. Crew members quickly marked the area unsafe for future landings. Within hours, the cruise company reinforced strict briefings for all guests, reminding them that in the Arctic, discipline around food handling was critical. Even a trace of scent was enough to attract apex predators from a distance. News of the incident spread quietly among passengers. Some were shaken into silence. Others stared long into the white expanse outside the ship's observation deck, now seeing past the beauty into the danger that lived within it. Lars spent the evening resting in his cabin, recovering from his injury. The thin scar that formed on his forehead in the following days served as a lasting memory of the moment when calm exploration had turned into a sudden fight for safety. It was July 17th, 2023, in a peaceful alpine village nestled between green hills and clear mountain air in Austria. The morning sky was bright and warm, and the stone streets were lined with wooden stalls filled with food from local farms. Stefan Müller, a 44-year-old school teacher, walked alongside Katrin Weber, a 39-year-old baker who ran a small family bakery in the nearby town. They had come early to the village market, hoping to buy fresh cheeses, mountain honey, and baked goods for Katrin's shop. Stefan had grown up in the Karawankan countryside and often spent time hiking in nearby forests. He enjoyed quiet mornings like this, surrounded by friendly vendors and the smell of fresh bread. Katrin was known in her town for her pastries and traditional sourdough loaves, which locals bought daily. She loved studying unique regional flavors to add new items to her bakery menu. The alpine markets were one of her favorite places to gather inspiration. The village square was lively that morning. Children ran across the cobbles, elders greeted each other, and farmers arranged wheels of cheese and smoked meats on wooden tables. Crates of apples, berries, and plums stood open beside baskets of pastries that gave off a sweet scent. The forested hillside stood just beyond the edge of the village, its narrow paths leading back into deep spruce and fir woods. Stefan and Katrin moved from stall to stall, tasting small samples of soft cheese and mountain butter. The sunlight reflected on rooftops and windows, and the air was calm. But unknown to the villagers, the scent of ripe fruit and warm bread had drifted into the forest above town. There, a young brown bear wandered near the tree line, its powerful sense of smell guiding it downhill. Food was easy to detect in summer, and the market below seemed like an open invitation. Without warning, a loud crash echoed from the edge of the square. The bear had burst through low bushes and onto the cobblestone street. Its fur was dark and thick, its nose lifted high as it followed the scent of food. People screamed and ran in every direction. Vendors jumped back from their stalls as the animal charged forward, knocking over crates of apples. Fruit rolled across the street, bouncing off barrels and market carts. Katrin tried to move quickly, but slipped on the wet cobbles, scraping her elbow as she caught herself. The bear pushed through a bread stall, sending loaves and cheese wheels rolling onto the ground. The wooden display cracked under its weight. Stefan, only a few steps away, grabbed a nearby wooden bench and dragged it between Katrin and the animal. He slammed it against several barrels, creating a loud thudding sound that echoed through the narrow street. The noise and sudden movement startled the bear. It paused, ears raised, then turned sharply toward the forested hillside. In a swift motion, it retreated the way it came, disappearing into the trees as quickly as it had appeared. Stefan kept the bench raised a moment longer, watching the tree line where the animal had vanished. The sudden silence that followed felt heavy, broken only by the rustle of wind through hanging banners and the distant clatter of a rolling apple. Villagers slowly emerged from behind carts, doors, and stone archways. Some stood frozen in disbelief, while others rushed to check if anyone was hurt. Katrin pushed herself upright, brushing dirt from her clothes. Her elbow was scraped and still stinging, but she was able to move. Stefan stepped toward her, his breathing slowly steadying as he looked around at the chaos left behind. The market square, which only minutes earlier had been calm and cheerful, was now overturned. Baskets lay crushed on the street, fruit mashed underfoot, and wheels of cheese scattered across the stones. A broken crate leaned against a fountain where water splashed onto scattered bread loaves. Vendors hurried to gather what remained of their goods, though many simply stood staring, still shaken from how quickly the peace had shattered. The marks of the bear's claws were visible on a wooden stall leg, deep grooves running through splintered timber. Katrin held her injured arm close, but assured the nearby villagers she was fine. A few others had minor cuts from stumbling during the panic, but no one was seriously harmed. The sight of fear on children's faces weighed heavily on the adults, who guided them away from the mess toward the safety of nearby homes. The air still carried the lingering smell of fresh food mixed with crushed fruit and damp earth from the bear's fur. Local officials arrived minutes later, notified by villagers who had run up the road toward the municipal office. They quickly assessed the scene and spoke with shopkeepers and witnesses. Several pointed to the open baskets of berries and pastries placed near the outer edge of the market, the area closest to the forest. The authorities marked the path where the bear had entered and left, noting how easily it had followed the scent trail into the heart of the square. Stefan helped move overturned tables and assisted elderly vendors in recovering their belongings. Katrin wrapped a cloth around her scraped arm while gathering scattered pastries to prevent animals from returning. The townspeople worked together to sweep the cobblestones and pack damaged goods away. Even in the aftermath, the community showed calm coordination, understanding that cleanup had to happen quickly before the sun drew in more wildlife. That afternoon, officials addressed the villagers about what had happened. They explained that bears often wander near human settlements during summer months, when food is abundant and scents travel easily. They advised all shopkeepers to secure food tightly, avoid leaving open displays near the tree line, and install wooden barriers along forest-facing edges of the market. Notices were pinned across bulletin boards, reminding locals not to leave fresh food unattended outdoors. In the following days, reinforced wooden fencing was added along the upper side of the square. Some vendors moved their stalls farther inward, away from the outer edge. Though life in the village soon returned to normal, many remembered how swiftly the peaceful morning had turned into chaos. Stefan and Katrin continued to visit the market each week, but they always kept one eye fixed on the forested hills above, knowing that nature could cross into human space without warning. The event left no major injuries, but it served as a lasting warning that even small villages must remain careful when living beside wild terrain.